Hello and welcome to the next session on the Times newspaper. This is the third session in this collection, all about the audience, which of course is part of section B. So we've moved away from the set text, the prescribed text from the exam board for the section A stuff, representations and media language. We've talked about industry at quite some length, and now we move on to audience. Just a quick reminder, this is something we will return to. I'm going to focus really on the online product for this session and really raise a few discussions and debates, but of course we need to look at our own set product as a group for the examination, the component 1 exam. Anyway, look, so this will be our learning objectives just for this session really. We're going to identify the target audience of the Times, discuss different readings as you'd expect, and then we'll evaluate the possible impact the text may have on an audience and the other way around. So reception theory, as well as a couple of sort of semi-effects theories, shall we say. But as I said, this is going to be more prompting discussion and debate, and for you to go and find out a lot of answers from looking at the Times Online and your own copies as well. So first of all, where else would we start but Stuart Hall? Okay. Now, his theory of reception theory is all about the fact that encodings and decodings don't necessarily, or decodings do not necessarily come from encodings, that readers and audience members may have a different reading to the text than is intended. But before we can do any of that, we have to know who the target audience is. So first question, from your knowledge of the set text and the Times Online presence, who would you say are the target audience? And of course, by this stage, when looking at any media product, we should be considering a demographic analysis. In other words, a profile of who the audience is, looking at different factors and bits of information, and of course a psychographic analysis where we could look maybe at the needs of the audience and other elements to do with their psychology. Now I'm sure for you found looking at this would come to mind that the Times predominantly has a middle to upper class audience, probably in that A-B category, A's and B's, possibly C1s as well, but mostly A's and B's. We're looking at a middle-aged audience as well, probably people in their 40s, 50s and upwards. You're probably looking at people, probably there's a predominant audience in the southeast of England. If we look geographically, we would probably find that the majority of the audience is white. We would probably find that the audience is mostly right leaning with their politics, possibly conservative supporting. We would find that most of the audience would have beyond secondary education, probably tertiary and possibly university educated as well, people who work in professions and so on and so forth. If we look at psychographic profiles, we're looking primarily at the succeeder audience group from the 4Cs model and the innovators from Fowles segmentation. If you're not sure what they are, make sure you go and look them up and find the evidence for it. So what can we use this for? Well, if we're going to apply this to Stuart Hall, we should be thinking about the evidence there is potentially to suggest that the Times promotes a negotiated reading for its audience. Okay, this is one way of looking at the Times, and it's worth considering even if you don't necessarily agree with it. Don't worry, I'll come on to the preferred reading in a second. But can you find evidence to suggest that the Times promotes a negotiated reading for its audience? In other words, is there evidence to suggest that the Times allows its reader to interpret and decode their stories via their own framework, allows them to make their own minds up, that there is an encouragement that you should just take the Times as a source of information without ideology, and that you can decide what you feel about each story? The flip side of this, of course, is to consider there is obviously a preferred reading to the text, and that this is going to be the one that the Times is pushing. And this, we can argue, as we've discussed in industry, from the newspaper's proprietor or owner, whatever you want to call him, Rupert Murdoch. To what extent would you say Rupert Murdoch's influence is being exerted in the newspaper? Find evidence of an agenda being set Okay, so you may need to go back to your notes on Rupert Murdoch and his own particular ideologies, or the agendas that he's pushed in maybe his other media, to see if it's that influence, that shadow is cast over the Times newspaper. So of course it feels, well, hopefully should feel only natural, that if an agenda is being set, that there is an ideological message being promoted, that we relate this, no surprises, to George Gerbner and his cultivation model. The idea that exposure to repeated patterns of representation over long periods of time can shape and influence the way people perceive the world around them. In other words, if you've been reading the Times newspaper for 10, 20, 30 years, how much has that drip feeding of ideological matters influenced your world view? So this is why the question, to what extent is Murdoch's influence exerted in the paper, such an important one. Okay, so what we're saying here is, why would the target audience that we discussed earlier be likely to accept the preferred reading? Why is it that our loyal Times newspaper reading audience would perhaps accept and believe in the agenda set by the Times? And if you remember, when we first introduced the idea of cultivation theory to newspapers, we also looked at this other model, the agenda setting function theory. If you remember, very simply, this lays out the idea that the media can't tell us what to think, but it can tell us what to think about. And it can tell us how to think about those things. So let's have a look. How can we apply the ideas laid out in the agenda setting function theory to the Times newspaper? So rather than it having this direct influence on what we're thinking, how can it tell us what to think about? And how can it tell us how to think about those things? Try and find some evidence to back up your answers. This actually allows us to introduce another theory, media theory, that's not part of the theoretical framework, but as I always say, it's important that we are aware of lots of other media theories, not just the 19 or 20 that are prescribed by the exam board. These should other additional theories, I don't say extraneous, but these additional theories should help your understanding of the media. And this next one is about the two-step flow theory of communication, which is quite surprised it's not on the theoretical framework. It's one that most media students would be expected to know. Anyway, here it is explained in just a short couple of minutes. Make some notes so that you understand what it's all about.
Welcome to Media in Minutes, where I talk you through important concepts in media and communication. In the early days of mass communication, people believed that the media had a direct and powerful influence on audiences. This way of thinking about media influence became known as the hypodermic needle theory. Of course, communication is a complex process, and this theory soon proved inadequate. In the 1940s, American sociologist Paul S. Lazarsfeld wrote The People's Choice, a book that summarized his research into the November 1940 presidential election. In the course of his research, he discovered that we're more likely to be influenced by other people than the mass media. Lazarsfeld called these people opinion leaders. Along with Elihu Katz, he later published a book called Personal Influence, in which he provided further evidence for this theory. The two-step flow theory suggests that opinion leaders pay close attention to the mass media and pass on their interpretation of media messages to others. Unlike the hypodermic needle theory, the two-step flow theory maintains that audiences are active participants in the communication process. And it's still a theory that has a little credibility today. In a paper presented at the 20th Annual World Wide Web Conference in 2011, researchers looking at the flow of information on the social networking site Twitter revealed that they'd found significant evidence to support the two-step flow theory. After analysing the flow of information, the researchers discovered that news finds its way to people through a number of prominent and influential opinion leaders. They found considerable support for the two-step flow of information. Almost half the information that originates from the media passes to the masses indirectly via a diffuse intermediate layer of opinion leaders who, although classified as ordinary users, are more connected and more exposed to the media than their followers. The two-step flow theory is also of interest to the advertising industry. A long time ago, advertisers realised that word of mouth and recommendations are a powerful way to sell products. Books like The Anatomy of Buzz are all about how important word of mouth is to advertising campaigns. A lot of campaigns set out to use personal influence by targeting opinion leaders. Anecdotally, this is something we can all probably relate to. We're more likely to buy a product if it's been recommended to us by a friend or someone that we trust. The two-step flow theory of communication is superior to the hypodermic needle theory in a number of ways. First, it acknowledges that audiences are composed of individuals who are part of a society. They actively interpret media messages and are influenced by people around them. Of course, this theory has some limitations as well. When we're thinking about modern communication, it's very likely that there's more than two steps in the flow of communication. Nevertheless, the two-step flow theory is still an interesting way to think about communication and media influence.
Okay, so that's quite a simple but a really effective and interesting theory for us to apply to a range of different media products, but particularly newspapers. But before we dig into how we can apply it to the Times and other media products, let's consider what kind of people opinion leaders are likely to be. So just give a short criteria for the sort of person, what kind of qualities, maybe what kind of standing in society would you consider to be an audience member that's not just an audience member, but someone who is what would be considered by the two-step flow as an opinion leader? Well, I'm sure you picked people that maybe held other positions of responsibility in society, maybe people with elevated positions in terms of jobs or status. Perhaps these are people with a certain knowledge in certain areas, respected, authoritative, or maybe people who are put into positions of power just by society itself. So how can we relate these ideas to our study of the Times and its audience? That's the next question. How might there be opinions? How might opinion leaders have an impact on how people understand the Times and its audience? Well, this is quite an interesting question because, of course, some people will use their newspaper as a way of learning about the world and perhaps even only a newspaper. But of course, they also use it for knowing where to stand on an ideological position. Let's take the example of Britain's exit from the European Union or Brexit. A lot of people understood the world and their reasons for voting the way they did from the newspaper that they were loyal to, and any newspaper that was pro-leave would put those ideologies forward. An opinion leader might be someone who, on reading the paper and having their arguments secure, might then go ahead and promote those ideas or arguments elsewhere in social circles, in family situations, to peers, to work colleagues, and so on. It might even influence the way a business is run, and so on. So, the Times readers, whilst are likely to be in leading positions of authority in society, can then take that forward and carry those opinions as well. They may even influence other people to read the Times. And this also leads us on to think about how the two-step flow can tell us more about modern audience contexts. So let's just give yourself a minute to think about this. How else could we apply this two-step flow to a modern audience? This is an old theory, but actually it seems to have been brought into sharper focus in a more recent era. So we're looking at not the media being an influence, but the audience being people who influence. Well, I try to emphasise the word influence with as much as possible, rather unsubtly, taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. But the word influence was to encourage you to think of the term influencer and how actually we're looking at online media. Now, if I say the word influencer, we might be thinking of YouTube as people who are there to encourage people to consume maybe clothing brands or video games and the like, but really they are, I suppose, modern day opinion leaders. In fact, this is probably what Lazarsfeld and Katz would be focusing their research on today. We can relate this idea of opinion leaders to those who spend their time on social media, encouraging people to consume other products. Are meant to be those who have the inside track on the cutting edge of society. which is interesting to us because, of course, the extent to which they actually are making a difference is being held to scrutiny all the time. In fact, there are several reports out in the past year or so to suggest that influencers really aren't as influential as some people think. However, some are paid huge amounts of money because they are seen as an influence, and that's really taking on that idea of opinion leaders from the two-step flow and moving it into, dare I say it, the 21st century. More interesting to us, though, is rather than looking at how effective they are, is looking at how this actually is more to do with how we look at audiences in media studies. And this should hopefully take us naturally on to Clay Shirky, who looks at the idea that the internet and digital technologies have had a profound effect on the relations between media and individuals. Absolutely. If we're looking at the fact that now ordinary audience members can become influencers, ordinary audience members are the way that which we look to, the people that we look to when we're consuming media or finding out about the world, then that's a complete shift in the way that news media and traditional media has previously organised itself. We look at Clay Shirky's next point, the idea that the conceptualisation of audience members as passive consumers of mass media content is no longer tenable in the age of the internet, as media consumers have now become producers who speak back to the media in various ways, as well as creating and sharing content with one another. This is entirely an evolution of that two-step flow. Opinion leaders are now creating their own content, telling people what to consume and how to consume. So, let's take this on and try and relate it, if we can, to our study of the Times. Now, I'm not saying you'll definitely be able to do this, but can you find evidence to suggest that parts of the Times audience are prosumers? I'm not suggesting that this will definitely be that target audience that we outlined earlier, but are there kind of secondary or even tertiary audiences of the Times newspaper that might be considered prosumers? You'll have to do some research into their online content, obviously, and their social media presence. So look for that evidence, and if you find it, why would this be important to the Times brand? Why would it be important for the Times brand for some of their audience to be prosumers? So do some research, see if you can find a couple of answers to these questions. One thing that is under no doubt at all is that there is a shift in the way that audiences use products. Even a product as old and as traditional and maybe set in its ways as the Times, well, there is an element that knows that audience isn't going to be around forever, and that more and more new audiences, no matter where they come from or what their ideological or cultural background, they will be familiar with a different media landscape. They will be used to using digital technologies, and many of them will be prosumers, as sort of coined by Clay Shirky. And this is a real shift in audience engagement. Of course, that has a knock-on effect when it comes to understanding and consuming an ideological message. So my final question, and this applies really to all texts, I suppose, when we're looking at prosumers or influencers or people who act as a sort of gatekeeper to media that are audience members. Does this shift in audience engagement, whereby we consume the media via prosumers or via gatekeepers, or we look to the audience more as an influence on our consumption than the media itself, does that shift in audience engagement mean that the ideological message of a media product is diluted or likely to have less of an impact? And why do you think that? Now look, there's never going to be a straightforward answer to that, because every audience member is different. We've almost gone full circle, haven't we? Because just as much as someone's ideological take on a media product might be diluted or influenced or shaped by another audience member or opinion leader, they might not. They may reject that influencer's message. We're going straight back into Stuart Hall and taking us round in a big circle. But I think it's a really interesting question to consider. You have a media product, say like the Mirror or the Times, which has a very specific media agenda. It has a very specific ideological message. In the case of the Mirror, pro-Labour, left-wing ideological, pro-Remain. in the case of Brexit. In the case of the Times, traditional, old-fashioned, owned by Rupert Murdoch, so anti-Europe, and we'll say on the right wing of the political spectrum. Okay, so it has its own agenda. However, if you are consuming those media products through someone else, maybe you're on Facebook and a lot of the people that you are friends with share articles from either the Mirror or either the Times, then they are sharing those for their own perspective, from their own political lens. They may be sharing them with their own comment. They may be sharing them saying, look, we should be paying more attention to this article, or this is something that we should be angry about. And all of a sudden, your own perspective is shaped by their take on an article. And this is something we can do ourselves. You can see what response, maybe share, if we were to share the same article twice, but with adding your own focus on something can change the message of the article itself. So I think this is a fascinating area of study for us, because audience members are becoming more and more influential in a world of social media. Many young people, as well as other generations, will admit that most of their news comes via social media. Well, there is not just the news that we're consuming. Then there is likely to be a two-step flow, and so Lazarsfeld and Katz' old theory has a completely new life breathed into it because of this. But of course, let's not forget that just because someone is sharing a newspaper or news article with their own agenda does not mean that you will respond in the way that they want you to. And that takes us right back round in a circle to Stuart Hall. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now. These are ideas that we will come back to when we study our own copy of the newspaper. But these are things that you should be thinking about and answering, not just for newspapers, but for all media products across Component 1 and Component 2. Thanks very much. See you again.